So, Ron, I'm particularly interested in this idea of a living faith that is not just rationalistic. I've seen many evangelicals walk away from the faith because it was an idea or a doctrine. It was in their head. And then the next idea that appealed to them, they could just trade it in quite easily. And on the other hand, I'm not asking that we exchange that for an experience that's purely emotional and that comes and goes and is based in sort of an adrenaline rush, and yet is a transforming experience and something deeper than emotionalism. And what I'm groping for is language around that, like Fleming Rutledge would say, a living connection. So that's the kind of thing I'm thinking about. What can you think about what that deeper way, the inner way, mystical without mysticism or something like that? But I really could use help with the language of that.
Oh, a superb question indeed. It's the sort of question that Western and Eastern cultures have wrestled with for thousands of years. But I think your question is good. At one hand, the danger of the extremes of rationalism or emotivism, or excessive heart and excessive head, and then they become disconnected. And so a person then suppresses their feelings, suppresses their heart, suppresses intuition, suppresses imagination in the name of getting ideas clear and distinct, or getting creeds and confessions. And then when the ideas don't line up perfectly in an absolute and certain way, because they've repressed the heart, and the head becomes the only mean of defining or understanding reality, and they can no more believe in an interpretation, a confessional, an exegetical, a political understanding, then they desert the faith entire, because everything hinges on getting an interpretation right. And when they reach points in the journey, it's not gotten right, or it's not certain, or doubt creeps in, then they desert, because the desperate need to have certainty overwhelms all things. And when doubt creeps into a certain certainty in that sense, and the feelings have been repressed, because that's just subjectivity, the need for objective knowledge dominates, and there's this link between rationalism and objectivity. It's sort of a form of scientism that creeps in to define how reality, whether theological, scientific, political reality, is defined. So this is also the dilemma, not only a certain form of rationalism, but a certain form of rationalism that's beholden to a certain scientistic approach that demands objectivity, or if I can't have it, then I slip into erratic subjectivism. So be wary of subjectivism that is not hinged to some sort of objective reality. Often what happens, the other extreme, is people who grow tired of the chess game of ideas and people moving the pawns around on the chessboard of thought. And for the pure rationalist, when certainty is denied them, often then cynicism, nihilism is the child that is birthed. Others then say, well, there's other ways of knowing than reason, as the heart. It is feeling. It is the subjective. It's the imagination. It's intuition. It's listening to desires. But just as rationalism can go bad, so the heart can slip into fantasy. It can slip into indulgent images. But that doesn't mean one denies the important role of the heart and imagination and intuition. The task is, how do we bring together? I mean, in the Greek tradition, they had the word nous, or Noetic, and that older mystical contemplative way of knowing, which is a Noetic way of knowing. It's like when we're called to repent. The Greek word here is metanoia, and this is nous, and it's not just changing one's mind about something. Nous very much is connected to the Greek, to ontology. So it's our very understanding of our being is altered in terms of an inner understanding of who we are, what we have to let go of in life to really be free to embody the divine image and likeness of God in us, or to be deified in that sense. And so when we get this classical understanding, which goes much deeper from a contemplative way of knowing, it embodies the best of heart and head in a deeper, more mature manner, and to the degree that integration of head and heart, thought and imagination is brought together, then in fact the what do we call the faculties or the organs of knowing um, are much more grounded, centered. It's what T.S. Eliot talks about, that still point in the moving world. And this is why the historic contemplative theological perspective really integrated at a much deeper level through a variety of meditative, contemplative ways, a way of bringing together, mature heart, mature head, so that one sees and is seen in a much more sophisticated and meaningful manner. So it is this classical, patristic way, contemplative way of knowing that allows us to transcend the tribalism of head or heart, rationalism or emotivism. It doesn't deny the role of mind and heart. It merely says both have to be deepened and both have to be integrated, not only at a theoretical level, but at a practical level also. And within the classical patristic tradition, this is taught in a most thoughtful, insightful way, but it's done in the context of abbas, spiritual fathers, ammas, spiritual mothers, within the context of community. This is done. And so these organs of knowing, I might also add, which we didn't perhaps talk about, is we live in a body. So not only these organs, but the senses. What's the role of the senses of knowing, and these interior organs as well as the exterior organs as ways of knowing. But to have a mature understanding, it's how do all of these organs or ways of knowing come together to make us much more deeper, and how is that done in the context of wiser women and men, in the context of community life, parish life, church life, and the role of that. And so it's a very integrated way of knowing, and because we live in a disintegrated culture, people grasp onto different organs as a way of knowing rather than saying this all has to come together. And that's the nature of Christian formation, is integrating all that we are in terms of what it means of the image of God, then living that out in a mature, thoughtful way publicly in the world as agents of justice, as peacemakers, as people committed to ecological issues. And so the inner way of knowing then has to move into the outer way, or what Hopkins called inscape and landscape. So I don't know whether that's a key in the ignition primer, and then obviously to get into the importance of these ways of knowing, I would say immerse oneself in the great contemplative theologians of Gregory of Nyssa, Greg of Nazianzus, Basil de Filicalia, obviously in the Orthodox tradition, the great Western mystics like Meister Eckhart, someone like an Erasmus of the 16th century is very important. Augustine in his own way certainly understands this in the Confessions, the City of God, Teresa of Avila, Hildegard. I mean, there's so many women and men that have grappled with these questions and refused to allow their ways of knowing to be fragmented as our dissipated culture is.
I have a follow-up question about that. So you're really describing knowing God, which is incredibly important, but it's a deeper knowing, contemplative and noetic knowing. I've observed this kind of knowing in people outside of the Christian faith. And without addressing that kind of with bland pluralism, where all paths lead to God, is there a Christian accounting for those who know God in these ways, who don't identify as Christian? I'm thinking of these, some of the great mystics. Let's say Rumi, for example. It appears impossible to me that he didn't know God, and yet he's not. His knowing of God isn't specifically Christian. What I'm trying to think about how a Christian who holds to the tradition might explain that or respond.
There's an interesting ending to C.S. Lewis's The Last Battle, which he was challenged by from many in which the Calormines were those who are not Narnians. So how could any Calormines be embraced by Aslan? And same with certain dwarves who were often seen as the enemies of Aslan. And Lewis took the position, and again, it's a classical Christian position of common grace, that there are women and men of all the great traditions. They may not use the content of Christianity, but the deeper experience of God can be very meaningful. So whether we talk about within the Jewish tradition, the whole Hasidic tradition, or the Kabbalistic tradition, you mentioned Islam, obviously there's variations of Sufism, but some of the great Sufi mystics, some of them actually are very personalist in terms of their mystical union with God. Within the Indian tradition, one of the greatest little books, one of my favorites, is Rabindranath Tagore's Gitanjali. Magnificent. You'd think you'd be reading something, a mystical work out of the Christian tradition, when a person reads Gitanjali. Some of the most insightful Buddhist writings, the devotional elements of for the Sikh tradition, the Adi Granth, very devotional, almost like Bhakti Hinduism from the Bhagavad Gita. So I think a person just has to be gracious and sensitive, not to negate or deny how people who are formally outside of the Christian tradition, actually some, I would argue, particularly some of the deeper mystics, you read the writings, it's decidedly, one cannot deny the obviously experiential component that they're dealing with. And so a good course could be done, I think, which could be very helpful for people to read the great mystics of other religious traditions. And I think that could reveal a lot. And when they compared some of the Christian mystics to, say, the Sufi mystics, or elements of the Jewish, or aspects of, say, the Hinduism, or some of the more sort of Pure Land Buddhism, some of that readings, or Taoism, and some of these heritage First Nations traditions, I think one would discover that, which isn't to say they're saying the same thing, we're not talking about a trite pluralism, but in reading these texts, I think a course could be done on comparative mysticism, which is not to say that all mystic, there is a whole tradition, it's called the perennial tradition, in which at the exoteric level, religions cannot be brought together theologically, liturgically, historically, exegetically. They can never be brought together. But at the esoteric or mystical level, they actually are one. So there's unity in the esoteric, disunity in the exoteric, and that's what we call the primordial. The danger of that is that one says that all mystics agree within traditions and between traditions, and they don't. I did my second MA on this very question at University of British Columbia, in which I had a teacher who was very committed to the primordial tradition, or the perennial tradition, and he argued insistently and dogmatically that at the exoteric level, of course you can't bring religions together, because they're so different in their origins, their history, their theology, their exegesis, their institutions, their myths, their symbols, all of these things. But it's the mystics at the esoteric level. So I decided that I was going to explore this by reading the mystics from Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Sikh tradition, Chinese Taoism, other traditions as well. I discovered that within traditions they disagree. And between traditions, they disagree. So within Judaism, you're going to have people within the Kabbalah or Hasidic, they're going to have their internal differences about what was the content of this experience and how do we define it. And within Christianity, you get the same. There's going to be affinities between certain elements of Christian mystics and Jewish mystics, or Christian mystics and Sufi, but then Sufis are often at. Well, I was fortunate to study with probably the leading Sufi mystic in the world in my MA studies, died a few years ago, wrote many books on Sufi mysticism, interpreted it to one of the great German interpreters of Sufi mysticism, spoke about 10 languages, and so it was a treat to study with her. But again, a very detailed analysis on her part in terms of different types of Sufism. So it's a sort of a big question, but I think one always has to be aware of two extremes. One is all mystics are saying the same thing, which they're not. On the other hand, taking the position that each religion is so isolated, has nothing in common with one another. One is the convergence model, the other is the divergence model, or the concord versus the discord. In the middle here, there's a very healthy place for, I think, meaningful dialogue between people within traditions who are committed to their heritage, but also trying to understand the insights and the wisdom. And this goes back to the early church. So what's the wisdom of Plato and Aristotle? What's the insights of Homer? So all it is translating the notion of general revelation or common grace the way the early Christians, actually they just didn't do it with the classics. They were also, as Christianity comes to be in a period of time of cosmopolitanism, just like today, religious pluralism. So Hinduism was very much in the sight of many Christians. Buddhism was various mystery religions of the classical traditions, Chinese religion. So the issues that people are asking today are no different than what early Christians were asking in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th centuries. And so we can glean much from the mothers and fathers of the church as they engage not only the classical Greco-Roman tradition, the danger of being tyrannized by the Greeks, but also the early Christians were dealing with Buddhism, Hinduism. You get Origen in Alexandria, you get all of the Mediterranean culture, and as Christians moved into India, as they moved up to what was called Albi in England, they're engaging the Celtic mystical tradition as well. So these questions have been with Christianity really since what John is doing with the Logos tradition. It goes back to Heraclitus and many others, but very important question, absolutely.
Thank you.